Atari 2600 during the NES era was good? Who knows what other surprises lie in store for us here on NES Works Gaiden, episode 76.
Feed me Seymour, feed me all night long.
The 2600 may have been well beyond its heyday by 1986, but that didn't stop Doug Neubauer from gracing the console with one of its greatest games ever. Everyone in the universe agrees. Solaris rules. Well, maybe everyone in the universe except the Xylons. After all, Solaris is about blowing 6 shades of hell out of their empire and retaking the planet Solaris for the sake of the Galactic Federation. But anyway, Solaris. You've probably been around long enough and played enough classic games to be familiar with the phenomenon of developers tapping into the potential of a piece of console hardware incredibly late in its life cycle, yeah? Think HAL Labs' NES and Famicom games like Kirby's Adventure and Metal Slayer Glory. Think Super NES stunners like Street Fighter Alpha 2 or PlayStation creations like Vagrant Story. Once a piece of gaming equipment has been around long enough for truly talented designers and coders to get a firm handle on its intricacies, and there's money to be made for the effort, you eventually start to see games that far surpass what anyone could have conceived in that hardware's early days. Atari 2600 had a few of those, but none stand out quite so much as Solaris. Can you imagine a kid in 1977 playing Combat and thinking, well, this is fine, but where's my visually stunning multimodal galactic conquest space shooter? I think like that didn't even exist at all in 1977. In fact, that sort of thing wouldn't come along until 2 years later, when Star Raiders appeared on Atari's 8-bit computers. And even then, it's hard to imagine anyone who had calibrated their brain to expect games like Indy 500 on the Atari 2600 to expect the console to somehow crank out something that surpassed the performance of the coolest game available for a much pricier piece of hardware. But as it happens, eventually the designer of Star Raiders, Doug Neubauer, turned his attention to the 2600. Although he really hoped to create an adaptation of Star Wars in video game form, eventually he accepted the fact that rights issues would make that impossible. So he set about turning Star Raiders into a console game, and that involved taking a healthy dose of inspiration from the other big sci-fi series with star in the title, Star Trek. Like the old unlicensed Star Trek computer games that proliferated on early microcomputers, Solaris involves traveling around a space map in order to take on foes and liberate planets. The maps even use icons that resemble Klingon birds of prey, just to drive the point across. Which isn't to say there isn't some Star Wars here too. I mean, you do spend a lot of time shooting down ships that look suspiciously like TIE fighters. The reality, of course, is that a game like Solaris simply couldn't have happened on 2600 back in the 70s. It's not just that Neubauer's skills as a programmer and designer had grown over a half-decade of work, the tech that made Solaris possible didn't exist at the time. Remember that Atari undermined its own port of Pac-Man, in part by being cheapskates and forcing Todd Fry to work with an undersized 8KB ROM. In 1982, the cost of doubling the cartridge's memory size to a more capacious 8K would have been fairly expensive. Well, Solaris shipped on a tremendous 32K ROM, a game so big it had to use bank switching to access its full memory capability. You may already be familiar with the term bank switching from the NES. It was the technique that made it possible for NES developers to create larger games by quickly swapping data into active memory by telling the CPU to look at different areas of a cartridge. The first NES game that I'm aware of to make use of bank switching arrived in November 1986 with Capcom's Ghosts and Goblins. In a weird, wild coincidence, Atari Archive indicates that November 1986 was precisely when Solaris hit 2600. In other words, Atari was playing the same tricks as Nintendo's partners in order to exceed the capabilities of their console. And exceed they did. Solaris stands up quite nicely to any NES game of a similar style. Heck, when it launched, Solaris simply had no equivalent on NES. That wouldn't arrive until late 1987 with ASCII and Acclaim's Elite-inspired Star Voyager. And let me tell you, Solaris crushes Star Voyager as an action game, as a shooter, as a strategic space simulation, and as a feat of visual art. This is one hell of a game by any measure, and the fact that it's running on 2600 makes it all the more remarkable. I mean, Thunder Castle on Intellivision was pretty cool and all, but Solaris eats its lunch, then it comes back to steal its dessert, too. In Solaris, you play as a fighter ship that sets out to liberate the eponymous planet, Solaris, from the dreaded Xylon Empire. Most of the game plays out as either a vertical shooter with a high viewpoint above a scrolling horizon, or a free space shooter with a behind-the-ship perspective. Your ship has a limited quantity of fuel that doubles as a shield against certain foes, and you only have 3 lives in which to save the universe, or whatever. As you advance further into enemy territory, you face more and more aggressive enemies, not just the Xylons, but also space pirates who will attack participants on either side of the battle. As in most space shooters of this nature, the action can be a little abstract at times, but Solaris does provide you with a simple radar display to help you pinpoint targets and threats. And you always have a pretty good sense of each incoming challenge, since the high-level mission here plays out through an interactive map screen. You need to make your way across the stars by way of a grid that depicts Xylon formations, pirate groups, captive planets, and more. Most of space is impassable due to blockades, so you need to move through the available passages and deal with enemy fleets that appear along the way. You zip through a warp jump gate to reach each new sector, battle your way through a formation, and warp back out to the galactic map once your work is done. In open space, that work generally just amounts to clearing out a set number of ships. On planets, however, you generally have a few objectives. You need to rescue captive Federation citizens, blast Xylons, and duck into any available entrances that lead to special combat quarters that you may happen to come across. Inside the corridors, you zip through narrow passages and attempt to snatch keys that unlock barriers. Probably the most challenging part of the game. There's a lot of variety to Solaris, and it has a lot of interesting gameplay wrinkles to trip you up. Perhaps the most taxing of these is the way that allowing the Xylons to conquer a section of space forces you to battle them in a so-called red zone, where space flashes a very intense shade of red while your ship suffers from reversed X-axis controls, as if Solaris weren't challenging enough already. Really though, it is an impressive piece of work, a game that leaps beyond the base capabilities of the 2600 and presents visuals that the NES actually couldn't have recreated due to its tile-based graphical system. I mean, really the best game we'd ever get on NES in this style was probably that port of Elite, which, while impressive given the hardware, looks awfully dull next to the fast, frenetic colors and action of Solaris. Wow, maybe Atari really is back. Oh, guess not. Unfortunately, it's not all good news and happy smiles here in the latter days of the Atari 2600, because on one hand you have Solaris, but on the other you have tax avoiders. The big selling point for tax avoiders? An actual IRS agent helped come up with the design, which actually is kind of weird when you think about it. Tax avoiders, as the name suggests, is about hoarding wealth and minimizing your tax burden. That's a pretty strange theme for an Atari 2600 action game, and most of what you need to do here only becomes apparent once you read the manual. Now, it's true for many 2600 games, sure, but few as undeservedly as tax avoiders. The action in a round of tax avoiders takes place over the course of a single calendar year. When December 31st rolls around, you want to have earned enough cash and invested in the proper tax shelters to have $1 million to your name. But if you think that would manifest in the form of a game where you make deliberate financial choices and sit down and properly plan things out, well, no. Tax Avoiders consists of 2 phases. First, there's a sloppy action sequence in which you ride an elevator between different floors, where green dollar signs and indecipherable red squiggles flash rapidly in place. You want to run and jump to collect the dollars, while avoiding the squiggles, which doesn't require any particular skill, just patience and a high tolerance for annoying, rapidly strobing images. Eventually, you'll end up in the next phase, where your little tax criminal runs and climbs on platforms while being pursued by a guy in a trench coat. The pursuer rapidly changes colors, and his color indicates his current role: IRS auditor, certified public accountant, or tax advisor. If the guy chasing you manages to catch up, his current color and role determine the outcome of your encounter. The IRS agent, for example, will just take a bunch of your money, while the advisor will help secure your earnings. I don't know if this was meant to be an educational game that went horribly wrong, or if someone actually thought, you know what would be good? A really janky piece of software where you run around platforms badly and the theme is tax evasion. Whatever the case, everyone involved was mistaken. Tax Avoiders is not good. It's kind of funny that this game exists, I guess, but the small private chuckle you experience when you see the box is literally all the value that the game brings into the world, and is as much Tax Avoiders as you need to experience. Now, some online sources give a 1982 release date for Tax Avoiders, but Computer Entertainer magazine treated it as a December 1986 release in its January 1987 issue. Given Computer Entertainer's commitment at the time to keeping up with all new game releases throughout the 1980s, I trust their chronology. But it really does seem like a pre-crash game, the kind of crap that precipitated the crash in the first place. Programmed by Dunhill Electronics and published by American Video Game, two companies that seemingly produced nothing else and about which very little is recorded, this is exactly the kind of weirdo, low-effort, Z-tier game that fly-by-night nobodies churned out for 2600 and wrecked the entire business with. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that this had been produced for release before the crash, but couldn't find retail buyer interest before the home console market shriveled up in the US and ended up being held over until the recovery era. But then again, this is just a useless piece of software that I genuinely can't be arsed to research myself. So I present this to you as your first homework assignment for the year. Fill this video's comment section with the details that I can't drum up the energy to find after having my zest for video games snuffed out by this garbage. And finally, a game on the bubble. Cubicolor is neither good nor bad. It's neither an official release nor an unofficial release. It is a Schrödinger-like mystery of a cartridge. Think of it as Schrödinger's cart. Technically, you can safely ignore Cubicolor if you simply want to collect a set of official packaged retail releases for 2600. Cubicolor never made it to retail, and it never ended up being sold in a package. Designed in 1982 by iMagic's Rob Fulop, Cubicolor was backburnered by the company because its genre, a visual puzzle, didn't fit their product plan, which called for a true action game release at the time. Like an awful lot of backburner releases for 2600 and television and the entire 7800 lineup, Cubicolor reappeared once American capitalism once again smiled on video games in the latter half of the 80s. Unlike, say, World Championship Baseball or Solaris, this backburnered game never enjoyed a true launch, probably because iMagic was on its last legs and barely scraping by as a computer publisher. Rather, Fulop dusted off a collection of prototype cartridges he had made during iMagic's brief time at the top of the heap in hopes of a future release. And once he gave up on that dream, he simply sold them via mail order, direct to consumers. Online sources vary as to whether he sold 50, 60, or 100 cartridges, but needless to say, the original authentic release of Cubicolor, which included a letter from Fulop, is wildly rare. I think the 2600 may have a few rarer vintage releases, like Air Raid, but that's cold comfort for collectors when they gotta fork over thousands of bucks for a bare iMagic cart whose title label was printed with a home label maker. But I mentioned in my introductory episode to the post-crash 2600 era that Atari's original console lived on for decades due to the homebrew scene. In a sense, you could say that started here. A game created with commercial aspirations, shelved for years, and eventually issued direct-to-consumer by its sole creator. Yeah, Cubicolor, if nothing else, can take pride in being the kickoff for the console's mighty homebrew legacy. As for the game itself, well, there's not much to it, honestly. You can understand why iMagic passed on it. The underlying idea seems to fall somewhere between a sliding block puzzle and a Rubik's Cube. You shift squares of color around a 5x5 grid in order to match a target layout. You need to move colors to recreate the color layout provided to the side of the playable space, setting the inner 3x3 grid to match, and ignoring the outer ring of colors. There's no real challenge to it, not even a scoring system or a timer to test your efficiency. In a sense, it feels like the Atari 2600's answer to Stack Up, a game whose puzzle elements create a challenge that players have to track and determine themselves. Or maybe Donkey Kong Jr. Math would be the more appropriate comparison, since there is some slight fun to be had in playing another person head-to-head and racing to see who can complete their puzzle first. Like I said, it's neither bad nor good. Cubicolor ultimately just feels like a game that needed a few more elements in order to be truly complete. But publisher disinterest in an uncooperative industry kept that from happening. So instead, it's more of an expensive curio for the truly maniacal Atari collectors out there. Bless their hearts. That's it for 1986. When next we circle back to Atari 2600 a few months down the road, we'll see if 1987 can uphold the momentum and the general excellence of 1986.